Actually, my presentation today is probably picks up where everybody else started this morning. We've been hearing this morning about the importance of improving production, productivity, food supply, etc. But we have not talked about the other coin, the other side of the coin, which is the food imports. And as Nadeem mentioned this morning, we have three pillars of the framework for agriculture strategy, which is particularly MENA imports is a very important component, and in particular wheat, because of its importance at the macro level, because of the fiscal implications and implication on the balance of payments, but also because it's the main source of calories for the majority of the population. Okay, this map, you've seen it too many times. I will not spend too much time on it. This is a scary picture. I'll spend some time on this graph, although we've seen it this morning, but the constraints in the region, particularly water constraints, and when you talk about climate change, how it's going to affect those resources. Oops. We don't think that this supply curve can be pushed too high. All the modeling done by FAO, by IFPRI, show that, okay, we can improve supply if we do all the necessary investments in research, development, etc. But we will still have to rely on major source of our consumption from imports. Now, on the demand side, yes, we can do some, if I may use the word demand management, which is borrowed from water. We can work on population control and nutrition, but also more important, we can work on better management of the food subsidy system, because there are lots of wastes, there's lots of mismanagement, and we could probably reduce that by working on target subsidies for the poor, etc. But again, maybe we could reduce by a bit. So the gap is going to remain quite large, and this is the thing is that this is getting larger and larger over time. So we cannot ignore this pillar of our food strategy. We have the three pillars as identified by the joint work we did, the World Bank, FAO, and IFAD a couple of years ago. Demand management, addressing demand, addressing supply, but also addressing the exposure to international markets. And for MENA, for the Arab countries, this is a very important component because of its increasing importance. And also because demand will keep growing because of the population growth and income growth and so on. Okay, so the study, I forgot to mention that this study was done by a team of colleagues from the World Bank and from FAO. I was not involved in that team. Unfortunately, they could not come, but I have the privilege of presenting their results. So I'll do my best to present the results as I understand them. So the study is on wheat import supply chain. We use the acronym WISC to refer to that. And what do we mean by the wheat import supply chain? We're focusing on this supply chain from the time the vessel arrives in Beirut, in Alexandria, and Jeddah, to the time it arrives at the flour mill, where it's ready to be distributed to the bakeries and retailers. So we're looking. The objective is to identify what are the bottlenecks in this supply chain, and what can be done to improve the bottlenecks, because we believe that the efficiency may not be that high, and because of the increasing importance, any savings in this supply chain will be quite significant and could be used to reduce our cost of importing wheat. This is a benchmarking study. In other words, that we used 10 Arab countries, Bahrain, Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, Morocco, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Tunisia, and Yemen. And we used 2 international benchmarks, kind of best practice. The Netherlands, the port of Rotterdam, is known to be the most efficient port in the world. But we also used South Korea, not because my boss is Korean, but because we needed a port in the Pacific and also one in the Atlantic to kind of get a feel of what are, because they are really the best practice in the world, and we look how our countries here compare to the benchmark. Now, if you look at the procurement, where do Arab countries import their wheat from? We see lots of diversity of different countries import from different sources of wheat. Some countries like Jordan and Lebanon, they rely almost exclusively on the Black Sea. The Black Sea, this includes Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, all the corridor that comes to the Black Sea ports. Whereas other countries, they rely on more diversified, like Qatar, you see more diverse sources of imports from the EU, from the Americas, Australia, and others. So there is a whole range of diversity. And the shift towards the Black Sea is because of the cheaper price of the Black Sea production, but also there's a quality. Usually the quality of the wheat from the Ukraine and so on is lower, and that's why many countries decided, okay, once there was the food price crisis in 2008, they shifted, and we see also Egypt also relies more and more on the Black Sea for their imports. But in this study, we did not take into consideration differentials in prices or quality. We just looked at overall import quantities. Now, looking at the average for the 10 countries, and using 2007 WISC, which is the wheat import supply chain costs. On average, it costs an additional $40 per ton from the time the vessel reaches the port until the time it reaches the mill, the flour mill. In other words, if you're paying $250 per ton for wheat for import and shipment, you're putting on top of that about $40 in terms of your cost of your supply chain. To compare that with our benchmark, I don't remember the figures by heart. So for the Netherlands, it's $11. And for South Korea, it's $17. So we see there's a huge margin for improvement, for improving the efficiency. If you look at differences between countries, now, as I mentioned, we use the Netherlands as our benchmark. So we used an indexing procedure where Netherlands is 1, and all other countries are compared to the Netherlands. So if you look at Egypt, for example, it's 4. In other words, the cost of importing wheat is 4 times as high as the best practice, which is the Netherlands. Most other countries are slightly better, but they're not that much better. We're talking about 3 times as high as the Netherlands, with the exception of Bahrain and Oman, who are about twice as high as the Netherlands. And the composition of the cost also vary from country to country. I should go back to the previous slide and explain also the composition of the cost, of the average cost. The largest component of the cost is what we call risk management. And then that includes overheads, includes cost of banks, cost of insurance, cost of profits, fixed costs, and also something that we don't measure, which is corruption cost, the cost of all the commissions that, and there's lots, we cannot quantify it, but mostly where we have government agencies involved in importing wheat, we hear a lot, we cannot quantify that there is a lot of corruption there. But the study did not touch this component. We touch at the logistics components. And this is the port logistics. This includes all the cost of downloading the shipment, the waiting time, the cost at the port. But also a very high cost is the transport to inland silos. So it's not just the port logistics, but inland silos, the transport. And the third component is the storage cost. And this includes operational stocks as well as strategic stocks. So as you see, as I mentioned here, the components vary from country to country. Each country has different. And as you see, Egypt has very high management costs. And I suspect a lot of that is due to bureaucracy, due to lengthy procedures, but also we hear a lot about corruption. And I think after the Arab Spring, with the issue of transparency and governance, has surfaced to the forefront, and we need to start talking about these issues. We cannot just talk about it in the corridors. In addition to cost, we also measure time. And of course, time is money, although the Algerians might disagree with us. The time that it takes a boat to a ship to unload and the waiting time. So this is how much time, if you look at our benchmark, again, Netherlands, it takes on average a vessel 1 day to unload its shipment, and 0 days, basically half a day to waiting time. There's no waiting time. Basically, the vessel goes straight to a terminal dedicated to loading cereals in bulk, and there's a barge that comes and takes, by using river transport, straight to the mills. This is the best practice in the world. We're looking at a whole range of different variability. If you look at for Lebanon, for example, and some of the Gulf countries, they have a reasonably quite good performance. And these are countries who are used to importing wheat. They are net importers for many, many, many years. The other extreme is Saudi Arabia. You see, the unloading time is 10 days. The reason for that is that Saudi Arabia for 20, 30 years have not imported wheat. They've been relying on complete self-sufficiency until recently, where they decided to phase out their wheat production and to be completely eliminated by 2016. And so they don't have yet the capacity, the investments needed to import grains. So the harbor of Jeddah and Dammam are made to import containers and industrial equipment, but they're not equipped to import grains. That's why the Saudi government is already investing heavily in improving their port facilities in order to reduce the time it takes for the waiting time and the time it takes to unload the ship. Finally is the inland transport cost. And this should not be underestimated, particularly for countries where, for example, Yemen, 51% of the whisk cost of the $40 on average goes to inland transport. And for Yemen, it's obvious because the infrastructure is very difficult, the topography is very difficult, and that's why it costs a lot of money. And also the waste of, from loading and loading from truck to truck, you lose lots of wheat in the process, and you have very high inland transport. Jordan, too, has very high inland transport for the simple reason that the port of Aqaba is on the extreme south of the country, whereas your consumption centers are in the north, and Aqaba is not using, Jordan is not using its railway, they're not investing in railways that could possibly improve their cost. If you look at Egypt, also we see quite high cost. We think Egypt, for example, is not using Nile transport. And this is a facility, most of European transport is done by barge, through on the river, the Danube rivers and other rivers. The Nile River is not used for transport. And this is a major issue that the Egyptians could invest in river transport, not only for grain, but for all other commodities. And this is one of the recommendations for the Egyptians in particular. So what are the key messages that I'd like you to keep in mind? Of course, we heard all day long today that Arab countries are highly dependent on cereal imports, particularly wheat, and therefore they are vulnerable to high and volatile international prices, not only vulnerable to price risk, but also to quantity risk. In case of war, for example, we hear lots of talk in the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, what happens particularly in the Gulf countries. So they are very concerned about the need to increase their strategic stocks. Supply disruption cause our national security concerns. Investment in wheat import supply chains are critical to reducing the country exposures to supply risk. Currently, Arab countries import about 40 million metric tons per year of wheat at an average cost of $40 per metric ton, the import supply chain. So this is $1.6 billion. If we save 10% of those $40, this will help us increase our strategic reserve by 1 month for the entire region. Strategic reserves, I think the next speaker will be talking more about that. They are very important for MENA. They can mitigate import risk for Arab countries. They can, so increasing the strategic reserve is a very good option for Arab countries, but it involves key trade-offs, including investment costs, including how long do you want to maintain reserve to cover 12 months, 6 months, and there are trade-offs, financial trade-offs, and risk exposure trade-offs. Finally, I'd like to stress again that focusing on the wheat import supply chain does not mean that we should forget about enhancing domestic supplies and better demand of management. We think that it should be part of the strategy. each country depending on their priorities, each country depending on their exposure to international markets. But we should not ignore this aspect, even for countries who are most of the time self-sufficient. At some point they have to import, so they need to pay a closer look to this aspect. Thank you very much.